Every financial crisis ends with the same theater. Politicians rush to microphones, bankers look serious, and new laws are pushed through under the banner of protecting the public. The message is always the same. Don't worry, we've learned our lesson. The system will be safer now. But if you look at history honestly, you start to notice something uncomfortable. That promise is repeated every time, yet the outcome never really changes. Now, before we go deeper, if you like content like this, where we break down money, power, and how these systems actually work, make sure you like the video and subscribe. Because what you're about to see isn't just history. It's a pattern, and once you see it, you won't be able to ignore it again. Because those laws that come after every crisis, they're not really designed to protect you. They're designed to protect the system, and more specifically, the banks that sit at the center of it. And while the names of those laws change, the logic behind them doesn't. The system is rarely fixed. It's stabilized. The story doesn't start with Wall Street or 2008. It goes back much further. In the 19th century, Britain went through repeated banking panics. Banks were issuing their own notes, credit was expanding rapidly, and crises were frequent. The response was the Bank Charter Act of 1844. It was sold as a reform to stabilize money and prevent chaos. But what it actually did was cement the Bank of England's monopoly over currency issuance. Smaller banks were pushed out, competition shrank, and power became concentrated in one institution that could no longer be challenged. This wasn't about protecting depositors. It was about protecting the system and making sure control stayed at the top. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced similar problems. During the Civil War in the 1860s, the government needed money urgently. So it introduced the National Banking Acts, claiming they would create a safer and more unified currency. But if you look closer, the mechanism becomes clear. Banks were required to buy government bonds if they wanted to issue notes. In other words, banks became forced buyers of government debt. It was a clever system. The government financed itself, the banks secured their position, and the public simply saw a stable currency backed by authority. What looked like protection was actually a way to bind the banking system directly to the state. Then came the Great Depression. Banks collapsed by the thousands, wiping out the savings of millions. Public anger was intense, and something had to be done. Out of that crisis came the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial and investment banking. It was presented as a way to protect citizens from speculation, to make sure that the money in your local bank couldn't be gambled on Wall Street. And for a while, it seemed to work. But there was a deeper effect. It restored trust without fundamentally changing the structure of the system. Instead of questioning why banks had so much power, the law reassured people that the system was now under control. Over time, that control weakened. Decades of lobbying slowly eroded the law until it was effectively dismantled in the 1990s, just in time for the next crisis to unfold. At the same time, deposit insurance was introduced. The creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was presented as a shield for ordinary people. Even if your bank failed, your money would be safe. It sounded like a clear win for the public, but it also changed behavior in a fundamental way. Before deposit insurance, banks had to act carefully or risk losing depositors' trust. After it, that pressure disappeared. People stopped worrying about what banks were doing with their money. And that allowed banks to take bigger risks, knowing that if things went wrong, the losses would be absorbed by the system. Once again, a law designed to protect people ended up supporting the institutions instead. Then there was the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. In the middle of panic, Franklin Roosevelt closed every bank in the country. When they reopened, something had changed. The government had effectively taken control of gold. Citizens were told to hand over their gold coins, certificates, and bullion, all in exchange for paper money. It was presented as a necessary step to stabilize the economy, even as a patriotic duty. But in reality, it transferred hard assets away from individuals and concentrated control inside the financial system. What looked like protection was actually consolidation. If you step back and look at these examples, a pattern starts to emerge. Laws don't appear after crises to protect people. They appear to restore confidence, stabilize the system, and keep everything from collapsing. The public gets reassurance, the banks get survival, and this pattern didn't stop in the 20th century. It just became bigger and more global. The clearest modern example is the financial crisis of 2008. When mortgage-backed securities collapsed, it triggered the largest banking crisis since the Great Depression. Millions of people lost homes, jobs, and savings. And yet, the institutions at the center of the crisis were not only rescued, they were rescued by law. In the United States, the government passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, injecting hundreds of billions into the financial system. It was sold as saving the economy, preventing total collapse. But if you look at what actually happened, the picture becomes clearer. Families were foreclosed on, small businesses failed, pensions were damaged, but the banks were stabilized using public money. Once again, the system revealed what it truly prioritizes. The same pattern appeared in Europe. Governments in countries like Ireland, Spain, and Greece guaranteed bank debts, effectively transferring those liabilities onto the public. Austerity followed. Wages were cut, services reduced, entire economies reshaped, but creditors were protected. Stability meant ensuring that financial obligations were honored, not that citizens were protected. In Greece, hospitals and schools were cut back while foreign banks were repaid. The language was about recovery, but the reality was long-term economic strain placed on ordinary people. Then came mechanisms like the European Stability Mechanism. It was presented as a safety net, a permanent solution to prevent future crises. But in practice, it created a system where financial institutions could be rescued quickly, while the conditions attached to those rescues, austerity, privatization, higher taxes, were carried by the public. Once again, the structure ensured that the system would survive, even if people had to absorb the cost. Even global regulations follow this logic. Agreements like the Basel Accords were introduced to reduce risk in the banking system, but in practice, they often created new ways for large institutions to manage or shift that risk. Assets could be classified in ways that minimized perceived danger, and risk could be moved off balance sheets into less visible areas. What was presented as protection became a more complex system that still favored those already inside it. So when you step back, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Financial laws are rarely neutral. They are written in moments of crisis, presented as protection, but designed to preserve the system itself. And that system is treated as essential, because without it, governments struggle to function, debt cannot be financed, and political stability is threatened. And where does that leave you? Your trust, your savings, your participation, all of it becomes part of what keeps the system standing. You're told that these measures are for your protection, but in reality, they are about maintaining stability at a much larger level. So the next time you hear that a new law is being introduced to protect you, take a step back and ask a simple question. Who actually benefits from this? Because every financial law creates winners and losers. And more often than not, the winners are the institutions, while the cost is carried by those who believed the promise. If this gave you a different perspective, make sure you like the video and subscribe. Because understanding how the system really works is the first step to protecting yourself from it.